Welcome to the second annual Women in STEM Gender Summit.
I'll bet he's got it. Yeah. And if
Hosted
not,
by
I'll shout.
Menina Kaifem. I'm Usha Srinivasan, and I represent a core of volunteers that has worked over the past several weeks, putting in hundreds of hours to curate what we believe is an amazing agenda featuring highly qualified experts to help move the conversation forward around gender bias, sexual harassment, and other very challenging topics. We are engineers, we are admins, we are entrepreneurs, we are mothers and daughters who left the workplace to take care of our children and parents. And when we came back, we found that there wasn't really a seat at the table for us. We are women who've been passed up for promotions, propositioned, asked to make copies, bring coffee. We are all those women. But we are also women who are determined to go beyond where the conversation stands right now, which is highlighting the problem. We owe a debt of gratitude to those brave women who came forward with their very difficult stories to draw much needed attention to this disease. But we are women and men who believe that now is the time to move the conversation forward, to come up with actionable strategies and insights that will help make a difference. We believe that that can only be done if we bring to the table all stakeholders who may come from different backgrounds with very different viewpoints. We made mistakes. We invited to this forum to put him on a hot seat a known harasser. We intended for him to be interviewed by a very well-respected journalist because we thought, misguidedly perhaps, that it would help us understand what the heck do these guys think. Understandably, the victims of this harasser were outraged. We understand their pain. We don't undervalue what they've suffered. We made changes, but we've paid a price. This conversation was intended to be much larger, but we had speakers that were contacted that felt like it was too much of a risk. They dropped out. We had sponsors who dropped us like hot potatoes, which we understand. That's how fraught this conversation is. So today we are proud to be here. We are thankful to Mira Call for providing us a platform to people like me, to the volunteers, a volunteer, for example, who had surgery just 2 weeks ago and spent 60 hours this week with a raging fever. To a single mother who is trying her darndest to find a job for which she is clearly overqualified, but she's volunteering her time. Erin and Shanu. So we are here because we want to make a difference. We are just regular, ordinary people. We don't have publicists. We don't have publications and books. We don't have blogs. But we are mothers of the next generation. And we want to make this place a better place for all of us. So thank you, every one of you, for being here. Thank you to our wonderful speakers. Thank you to the awardees who've come from far and wide, many paying their own fare. Thank you for being here because it means a lot to us and to the next generation. So today I hope you will take away from this amazing panel some very good insights that you can then just translate into real action. And that would be the best way to honor our wonderful volunteers and this platform, which is bigger than all of us. So welcome and thank you. And I'd like to now invite to the podium our very esteemed scholar, Leanse, who will speak about the neuroscience of equality. Oh, before I start, Erin is shooting daggers at me because she told me to tell you that the restrooms, you go out this way into the back. It is.
It's very important.
And also, please feel free to help yourself to food and drinks throughout if you want to move forward so we can kind of be a nice, cozy group. That's it. Thank you, Ellen.
Thank you. Is there a clicker?
Yes, there is. It's on the podium.
It's on the podium. This is great. Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Before I start, I want to take a moment to tell you, Usha, how beautifully you introduced this conversation. Everything I heard you say was fair, balanced, curious, and open-minded, and came from a place of empathy for all involved.
Thank you.
And if all of us could channel some of what you shared in that short introduction, we would be living in a better world.
Thank you.
Yeah, so thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. Hi, everybody. It really is such an honor to be here. And I made a big decision last night. You know, I've met a couple of you before, and in fact, I met some of you in this room in a setting where I gave a talk, more or less the talk that I had planned to give today. But I listened to the conversation that was taking shape around this gathering, and I made a pretty bold decision last night to go off script. And if I'm a little tired, it's because I really got into it. I pretty much rewrote what I planned to share. Some parts will be familiar if you've heard this talk before, but some parts will be very new. So I have some handwritten notes here that I want to do to set context, and with your permission, I'll read them. So first, I do want to disclose I'm going off script, and in fact, the way I thought of it is I'm going to boldly go where probably few talks on gender, and certainly on neuroscience, have gone before. And I invite you, in fact, I really ask you to doubt me, doubt everything I say, except for the science, which I'll point out, this is as well as we know it right now. But some of the things I'm going to share are theoretical, and I want you to doubt me. In fact, in Buddhism, there's a saying, it's often attributed to Buddhism, it says, doubt everything, be your own light. But I encourage you, if you doubt me, to use that as an invitation to consider your alternate story, the one you don't doubt, and look deeper at it and doubt it as well. Doubt everything doesn't mean doubt selectively. Being your own light doesn't mean deciding what you doubt and what you filter until you've been curious, until you've asked questions. And I invite you to doubt me, but I ask you not to judge me. Because judgment also from Buddhism elicits a really important question. And it's a question that's been very helpful in my life as an educator, as an executive coach, as an author, and in many other paths. And that is, what do I not yet understand? When I feel judgment, I've learned to feel that as an invitation to learn and consider more, to move beyond my assumptions, biases, and blind spots, and out of the mental constructs of what I've been told is real, and into an area where I can get to a deeper truth. And as a neuroscientist, I'm not a PhD neuroscientist, don't get me wrong. I'm a person who studies neuroscientists. So please, for those of you listening or being recorded or watching this later, let me strike only that word. But as a person who studies neuroscience and who refers to the brain in so much of my thinking and the work that I do, I have learned that neuroscience is proving that almost everything is a mental construct. Processing all of the information that we get from the world is very complex and would take brains much bigger than we could carry around in our heads. 3 pounds would not do the job to process the trillions and trillions of bits of information coming in at every moment. So the brain develops shortcuts, and the shortcuts are what allow us to make sense of the world, to navigate the world. I would not be able to walk across this stage if I had to really think about how my legs were moving and how my feet were landing. I would not be able to walk across this stage if I were questioning if this is really a solid ground, which on a quantum level, there could be questions about that. It was very, very interesting stuff. So the first thing I want you to doubt, but not judge, is that everything is a story, a construct of reality assembled by our brain that allows us to make sense of and navigate the world so we can survive. Doubt it, but don't judge it. Ask a deeper question. We all have deeper questions inside. And I'm going to go there in our talk today. So I've learned that judgment is a threat response. And in my slides, I'm going to show you what threat does to the brain. It's quite astonishing, the fight or flight or freeze reaction. Judgment is a threat response. It's one that triggers our most basic survival systems. And we all know what that feels like, right? When we get triggered, we feel that constriction of fear. And it really is a constriction. We'll talk about that in a few moments. But as a systems and design thinker, I've also learned that curiosity is an incredible problem-solving tool. Comfort with questions and with ambiguity is harder and braver than comfort with answers. And yet the brain seeks answers so it can make sense out of what it calls reality. And in a culture and a time and a society, especially in tech, that is increasingly comfortable with answers and with data and with disambiguating, we are training our brains, because our brains will do more of whatever it will do right now, to get away from ambiguity, to avoid ambiguity, and to be uncomfortable with it. And yet discomfort is where the growth happens. It's where we really activate our highest cognitive potential and integrate different parts of the brains to come up with better understanding and better answers. So we're going for the questions today, and some of these are going to be uncomfortable. But I promise you they'll be safe. Everything I share will be offered in the spirit of the opening talk, which is with respect, which is with a true heart, head, and commitment to equality for everyone in this room, and also with a tremendous amount of hope that we can change our mental constructs to create something that's better for all of us. Now, we probably have some technical professionals in the room, right? So the first question I have to ask is, does anyone know what a spectrum is? Does anyone want to raise their hand and give us a brief definition of what a spectrum is? It's not a trick question. Nobody's going to get trapped by this one. What is a spectrum? Anyone? Thank you. What's your name?
Salah.
Thank you so much for sharing your definition.
Technically, it's the spectrum in the light, but I think it implies a wide and great range.
Range. And is it continuous or interrupted, a spectrum?
I'm inclined to say it's continuous.
Continuous. That probably, usually if we think of musical notes, or if we even look at oscillation, we're going to see in the spectrum we're moving through a range on a continuous level. Or there is an interruption. There's a pause and a dip and the wave changes. Would that be fair to say? Cool. Who saw a rainbow this morning? Good. Anyone else? I saw a beautiful one as I was leaving my home in San Francisco, a really big one, like spanning the sky. And I looked at the colors of the rainbow, the spectrum. But I remembered something really interesting. A spectrum is continuous. So why did I see bands of color? Why? Well, that's a mental construct. From the time I was a tiny child, I was told, this is blue, this is red, this is orange, this is yellow. So my brain, that obedient machine that it is, took that continuous and uninterrupted spectrum of light and interrupted it to call things colors. That's bias. And it's part of the way I navigate the world. I couldn't navigate the world. You couldn't navigate the world if your brain didn't take shortcuts like that. It's a very, very powerful lesson. And it allows us to question, how is what we see really reality? Did that example make sense to everyone in the room? That's pretty interesting. I can't take credit for it. I should have brought the book that I learned that from only a few weeks ago. It's a book that became available last week by a brilliant neuroscientist whose name is Lisa Feldman Barrett. And she wrote a fantastic book called How Emotions Are Made. And it challenges scientific assumptions, how emotions are made, about what emotions really are and how innate and universal they really are. She does a fantastic job challenging the biases that were brought in the science of studying emotions. And she reinforces a belief that is very consistent with the edge of neuroscience right now, that everything, well, not everything, but that more things are learned and conditioned, artificial constructs, mental constructs, stories, than we have ever known was true. I highly recommend the book for anyone who's interested in neuroscience. By the way, it's also an Audible book, and it's a terrific Audible book. Okay, so the rainbow. So our brains have learned to identify and label color, and boy, do our brains love to identify and label things because it lets us think fast, and we'll talk about that today. It lets us use System 1 thinking for anyone who's read Daniel Kahneman's book, Thinking Fast and Slow, that nice, fast, reactive answer that often contains bias, blind spots, assumptions, and errors, rather than shift into the more consumptive, and the brain loves to save energy, but the more fuel-consumptive, slower-moving parts, slower-thinking parts, less efficient parts of our higher cognition, largely in our prefrontal cortex. The brain is all systemic, so it's not quite as anatomically distinct as that, but generally speaking, that's a shift. So challenging mental constructs takes more energy, so the brain resists it. The brain loves it a fast answer. It loves it when someone walks into the room and go, that's a person like this. What is that person doing here, whatever it is. It loves judgment, because judgment allows the brain to do its job, to keep us safe and alive. We're told that the brain's job is to think, but the brain's job is really to think in service of keeping us safe and alive. And if we're doing that, in that case, the brain is going, everything I've done is perfect because she's safe and alive. I don't have to change a thing. Go to that fast, familiar memory and act on it. Don't think about that because it's conserving energy. For that time, I'm walking down a street in San Francisco and a saber-toothed tiger jumps out from between two buildings, and I need energy to run from it. That's the power of the fight or flight response, and it's a huge part of our evolutionary biology. We'll talk about that in a minute. So what I want to ask you to do is to, today, challenge mental constructs and open your minds to possible scenarios, because constructs can be changed. If you think about it, it's all stuff we've learned. The brain has an amazing capacity to learn. Constructs can be changed, and we can move to higher level possible mindsets, which means we can move to higher level possible futures. And isn't that what we all want? Something better than what we have right now? So thank you for letting me go off script, and now the real talk begins. And I'm going to come down here so I can make sure I see my slides. So let's see. Here we go. An early human ancestor who saw this and thought it was a snake made it back to the cave that night to do a little something we can all be thankful for. The one who looked at this and thought it was a stick, not so much. Fear and jumping to a conclusion of things being dangerous or threatening served us as early humans trying to find our way in inherently dangerous and risky environments. Jumping to a conclusion in a minute, not stopping to think about that thing on the path. Is it a stick or a snake? Didn't serve us. Jumping to conclusions, because I've said that a little bit backwards, but jumping to conclusions going, that's a snake, did. That's been programmed into our genetic code from our earliest time on a survival level. And yet, in this thing that we have called the brain, the fear response and the reaction to fear changes our thinking as we're going to explore. And there's only one thing I've noticed that shuts down our thinking and limits our higher cognitive powers as much as that fear response to the possible snake in the grass. And that's homogeneity, being too comfortable, being locked into patterns of safety and comfort and lack of curiosity with people who are our echo chamber, who are too much like ourselves. This is what you want. You want access to the whole brain. You don't want to be in fight or flight mode, nor in set and forget mode. If fight and flight was the red oval, set and forget, that's the blue oval. What we want to be in is fire and wire, which is a state of continuous growth and development, becoming higher versions of ourselves. And I'm going to talk about how your brain on equality, and look, there's a rainbow. I didn't even know that. That's so fun. That is really great. This is your brain on equality. Your brain on equality is firing and wiring in ways that allow you to achieve one of the three things that I think is, maybe allow you to achieve all of the three things that are core to human satisfaction and even happiness. And that is relationships, contribution, and growth. Your brain on equality is optimized for building relationships, contributing fully, and growing. I want to talk about the triune model, and let's give this slide a farewell because I'll never use this word triune again. So let's wave it off, say goodbye. Bye, triune. This new book by Lisa Feldman Barrett really challenges prior thinking about the triune brain model and really explores, not really explores, actually explores how much more integrative the brain is than we ever imagined. But for really a basic introduction, I'm going to explain the triune model. And don't think of it as precise and anatomical. Think of it more as, if you will, allegorical, really talking about the different types of things the brain does. Deal? So challenge my science. I'm doubting the science now. One thing that's amazing about science, darn it, is things change. So you do things like publish papers or books, and then they come back and it's like, oh, not true anymore. But we're doing the best we can. The first thing is we all have a body brain. And I like to think of the brain as evolving. If you look anatomically at the way the brain evolved, if you think of it, it started in the back with our more physical movements and regulation of body systems, and it moved forward to processing more and more information until it came up to this area of the brain, which we'll talk about, which is about higher cognition and really this very uniquely human thought. I like to say if I had my chimpanzee cousin here with me, she'd probably be a little shorter than that. But her forehead would go back like this, as would any other primates. Humans have a uniquely straight forehead like this because we actually have more real estate relative to any other primate in the prefrontal cortex. And this is where we do our most human thinking, if you will. But the body brain's in the back, and let's give it a shout out because we could not do anything that we do unless the body brain was running the autonomous functions in our body, our breathing, our blood flow, our heart rate, all of these different things. If I asked anyone in the room right now to turn up their spleen a little bit, could anyone do it? No. But your brain is regulating that all the time, the body brain. I love the body brain. It has as much neuronal density right back there in this highly evolved, highly developed, highly debugged, efficient machine as the rest of the brain has in all of its cognitive areas. It's a powerhouse. We're all lucky when it works well. By the way, side note, and I talk about this in my book, it is hackable. There are people who can use power of mind, power of training, and power of breath to actually make changes in their body systems that we've previously thought were that were completely autonomous. So it's kind of an interesting thing. New guy, anyone heard of the Iceman, Wim Hof? Yeah? It's amazing what he can do. It's crazy, right? He can hike to the top of a sub-zero mountain in his bare feet and be completely warm and dance. His core body, have a great time. His core body temperature doesn't change. He's learned to use power of mind to control that. Crazy stuff. By the way, there are certain sects of Tibetan monks who can do it too. They can raise the temperature in their hands, if I recall correctly, up to 12 degrees, the temperature, simply through breath and power of mind. So we are much more hackable than we see. I don't do that stuff. I don't know that much about it, but it shows how powerful intention is over the workings of the mind. Thanks for letting me meander. I told you I was going off script. Then there's the limbic system. And again, we'll say farewell to this slide as well because Lisa's research proves that this is really opens up new thinking about it, much more systemic than we've imagined before. But the limbic system is generally considered the home of memories and emotions. And it's important to know that where memories and emotions are stored is very central to the brain. In a moment, we're going to look at more of the, that gray stuff, the cognitive stuff. Notice the central location and how the cognition is wrapped around it. The brain is constantly referencing memories and emotions to make sense of the world. And what we think is rational thought is nearly always shaped by something that's highly subjective and highly emotional. That's the way our brains work. And emotion is really important in human societies because it implies we have to be social beings. We can't survive and certainly can't reproduce solo. So we have to have a huge part of our interaction and of our cognition wrap up into emotional and social intelligence. Then there's the cortex, and that's the thinking part of the brain. It's the part we think with. But as I said earlier, thinking is in service on a biological level to safety and survival. So although we're thinking, the underlying on a biological and also on an emotional level, a condition level, is really about keeping us safe and alive. And then there's the PFC, the prefrontal cortex, which is the home of our highest human cognition. And this is where we do many higher order cognitive functions, including things like long-term planning, if-then scenarios, intentional thought, self-regulation, mood regulation. I feel like yelling at this person, but I'm going to do something else instead. This is where we check ourselves, and we come up and we activate a higher intention. the brain resists using this because remember, the brain's objective is to keep you safe and alive. And this area is more energy consumptive than the other functional areas of the brain. And in Kahneman's book, we talk about fast thinking and slow thinking. Generally speaking, we can associate fast thinking with the older parts of the brain, the less differentiated part of the brain, and slow thinking with the higher order, less fuel efficient, but most uniquely human parts of the brain. So remember, early on I said with the brain sort of generally speaking evolved from back to front. This is the most recently evolved. Technologists in the room know that new products sometimes have a few quirks and a few bugs. But there it is, at least we have it. I want to talk about the amygdala hijack. The amygdala hijack, is anybody familiar with the term and know what it means? Yeah, love to hear you.
I've heard it described as kind of flipping your lid.
Yeah. It is. It can be. It is. Yeah. It's actually really good. You know, in this picture, it kind of shows it like that. You said flipping the lid, but it can be. The amygdala has many jobs. It's a filter for all kinds of information. But it seems to be the place that originates the panic button when we're in some sort of threat. And the panic button is really interesting because in a fraction of a second, faster than cognitive thought can be formed. In that, I think it's 0.003 seconds, whereas we can detect a cognitive thought at 0.010 seconds, I think is the number. But in that fraction of a second, it sends a powerful chemical message surging through your body that says, shift gears. Get out of how you were before that snake started on the path and get into the mode where you're fighting, fleeing, or freezing to save your life. It's in survival mode. And it literally has one of the chemical responses. There's some 30 neurotransmitters that are involved in this response, led by epinephrine or adrenaline. But in that moment, one really important thing is vasoconstriction. I'll tell you what it means, blood constriction. Has anyone ever noticed when they get scared, you get pins and needles? Well, the chemical reaction in your body is sucking blood away from your skin. Your skin is an organ. From that organ, and pushing the blood down, because it's full of oxygen and nutrients, into the muscle layers, so you're better at fighting or flighting. Now, it's also taking blood away from the prefrontal cortex and locking you into fast routine thinking, because it doesn't want you thinking, oh, look, I've never seen a stick move like that before. Right? Because your brain's job is to keep you safe and alive. So when we have an amygdala hijack, our higher human cognition shuts down. I think the same thing happens with a homogeneity hijack. And this is a term I made up for a talk, thanks to you, Eva. So Eva had a really great gathering on equality. And as I started thinking about the neuroscience of equality, it came to mind that when we are running our routine modes in a state of comfort, is there a chance, I became curious, is there a chance we're not accessing the PFC, we're not accessing that higher meta-thinking and challenge assumptions curiosity that really leads to higher level thought? So I began to research. I researched with sources spanning, original publications from researchers, from scientists, from neuroscientists, behavioral psychologists, behavioral economists, also from really interesting business papers published by people like the World Economic Forum, by Harvard Business Review, and the information was extremely consistent. And that is, when we work with people unlike ourselves, it's a little more difficult at first, because we're not comfortable. But once we've gotten through that, if we stay committed to the path of equality, on the other side of that are dazzling results, and I'll share some of them with you now. Dazzling results, improvements in accuracy, efficacy, market readiness, and smooth operational implementation, and beyond. Equality causes everyone to win on a brain level as well as on the other levels that we've seen. We want active engagement of all parts of the brain. And by the way, the body is giving us tremendous amounts of information anytime, our feelings. In fact, our body is signaling us when we see someone different than ourselves to have a little bit of a fear response. And one thing I want to mention to both the women and the men in this room, and anyone in this room, everyone in this room, is women walk a world where there is a presence of threat. We have been, and people of color do this too, and women of color do this, I think, intersectional people do this on a double down basis. We walk the world either with a set of threat or having to carry a cognitive load, which means extra work our brain has to do simply not to be pushed back into that threat mode. What would be possible if people were unburdened from that load that they're carrying? And we could walk into every room the way I know we have all walked into this room today, curious, open-minded, and looking at each other as equals. And even in the opening talk, even people who've made mistakes and have come back saying, I've learned, being open to them as equals. There's a phrase I learned in prison. I really did learn it in prison. I learned it at San Quentin. I wasn't an inmate there, but I was working with inmates there, who were some of the finest people I've ever had the privilege to meet. They were people who are working on a program called The Last Mile that teaches technology and entrepreneurship skills to inmates at San Quentin, even if those inmates are in at life sentences, for life sentences. And here's what I learned. Hurt people, and healed people, heal people. All of us can remember that and ask ourselves, when we're hurting people, what's hurting in us? And when we're lifting people up and encouraging them, what's healing in us? One of the things we learn when our brain is on equality is that as teams and as individuals, we have more accuracy and fewer errors. And this is from the New York Times, citing a really important research study last year. When surrounded by people like ourselves, we are in bias. We're more easily influenced. A person like us can convince us something is true and cause us to trust them, to outsource our critical thinking to their thinking, rather than question everything and be our own judge. When we're surrounded by people, we're more easily influenced and more likely to fall for the wrong ideas. We're less prone to critical thinking, error detection, and accurate calculation. Anybody read a homogeneity hijack in those words? Right? When we're with people that we treat as equals, we have more creativity and innovation, because creativity and innovation require the integrative functions of the brain that move across different centers and, if you will, make more noise than those emotional centers that say, keep it safe, keep it down, keep it quiet. And they say this mirrors the psychological competencies associated with the creative process: divergent thinking, openness, curiosity, openness to experience and perspectives of others. But it only happens in cultures or in settings of knowledge sharing and respect. Fewer unintended consequences. Have we all been hearing that word lately? That phrase lately, unintended consequences? Look at the unintended consequences of our reliance on mobile technologies. It's changing our brains and even our emotions at an unprecedented rate. Many people in tech are calling out, we didn't see this coming. We didn't know this was coming. Fewer unintended consequences when you bring diverse, included, and equal voices together to get out of assumptions, blind spots, and biases. I have a favorite experiment I like to do about blind spots. I don't know, I think this crowd's a little younger than I am, some of you. When I was growing up, we didn't have iPods, we didn't have mobile phones, we didn't have anything. You'd go out into the garden and play with a bug for 2 hours. Right? That was called entertainment. But one of the other really silly things we did for entertainment was we'd take our two fingers like this. Go ahead and do it. Maybe some of you have done this. And then we move them together like this. Oh, yeah. And then we look a little bit beyond it and something really weird happens. Anybody notice? Anybody see anything weird? Look a little beyond it. Put it at the level of your nose and sort of look beyond. Maybe wiggle it and see if anything happens. Anybody see anything weird? The floating sausage finger? Anybody get a floating sausage finger? So we have an ocular blind spot right here. Think about the way your pupils work. They can't see this space. But your brain looks and goes, don't worry, I got you. You have a floating sausage finger. That's a blind spot. That's how the brain jumps to conclusions. Fewer unintended consequences when we have people challenging the assumption, saying, you don't really have a floating sausage finger. It's an ocular blind spot, and you're going to be fine, right? So when surrounded by, oops, let's move forward rather than back, you also have better ethics and compliance. You have the people who go, wait a minute, is this really the just and right thing to do? You know, in the Wells Fargo scandal, in the Volkswagen Dieselgate, and in several other things, we get to the point where we say, why didn't people ask? And one of the things that people come up with is, there was nobody here to challenge my assumptions. There was no one to hear say, but wait, what about this? That does not happen in environments where people feel safe with their equality and where diverse and multi-representational voices are in the room. So this is really important on boards, and this actually, per the Russell Reynolds study, is exactly why boards that have diversity are doing so much better. People challenge assumptions, get out of their safe zones, and into more generative and inclusive, and more, they debug the problem before it becomes a problem. And this is best done through a robust dialogue of typo, differing views, as long as they are offered respectfully and listened to carefully. That's equality. So there it is. And then as a result, we get higher profitability, retention, and growth. Diverse teams, inclusive teams, equal teams are simply smarter. Yay. And we all want that. But now I want to tell you something that is really the mind blower. And I told you I'd go off script, and I'm going to go fast because I only have 10 more minutes. In order to understand something really important about the mental construct that brought us to this moment in time where we don't all feel like equals, we have to go back in time. And I mean way back in time. We have to go back to a time when we lived in places that look like this more than they look like this. We have to go back in a time, this is about 35,000 years old. It's the first carving ever found, was found in Germany, the first carving ever found of a human, of any sort of form. It's the first found human carving. It might have been ritualistic, it might have been simply an amulet, we don't know what it is, but it's the first carved decorative object in human history. Found in a cave in Germany, 35,000 years old, and carved of mastodon ivory. And you can't really tell from this angle, but it's of a woman, it's of a goddess. And we have to look to early human art, and there's something we have to know about early human art. Art is only produced in societies, or at least in prehistoric times, and today there's art that's produced in protest, even under hardship. But art was only produced when societies had enough excess that they had time and energy to commit to art, to create art. A society had to be flourishing in order for people to generate this very extra thing called art. And art, there seems to be a correlation, it's hard to know if it's causality or something else, but there seems to be a correlation between art and human flourishing, as well as there's between human flourishing and art. And we have to go back and look at this art and learn from it. Here's art that shows, it's the first image of art, this is from India, but it's the first image that is known of that shows children in art. At that time, something very different than what we prioritize around now was available, was a survival mechanism in human cultures. And that seems to be equality. Now, how do we know that? We know that through archaeological remains and the archaeological record of the way people were buried. Ritualistic burial for people who held power, even in very, very early times. Anyone here tried the paleo diet? Paleo, about that early, like caveman food diet? Yeah. We're talking paleo sorts of times. And if the food worked to keep us going, maybe the culture could work too. But in paleo times, it seems that there was equality. Men and women were buried in equal numbers in ritualistic burials. And we know that from the other people who were buried around them, usually at different times. It's not like they were killed and buried around them. That came later. Don't worry, that does come later. But they were, yeah, right. They were buried with the same amount of objects, ritualistic gifts or objects for the next life. Men and women were buried in that way equally. That says something. Also, early carvings were of women. They were probably ritualistic. These were worship items. And if we look at several new models and new interpretations of the archaeological record, we are getting really interesting information about the way people lived. We also get it through a really hard form of science, which is DNA, the genetic record. The genetic record also shows that there were very different mating habits than we live in monogamy today. There was probably more polyamorous and collective sorts of mating habits, and we can really diagnose that because the pure partnering model that we have evolved to now does not answer some of the big questions about our early gene pool as humans. As I'm saying, doubt me, doubt everything I said, be your own judge. I don't have answers to this, but I have some better questions than I had a few years ago when we didn't have this information. And I'm not seeking the answers until I get even better questions than that, but I'm sharing the questions with you. I'll move quickly through this. One more of these. This is Crete, Minoan Crete. Has anyone studied the Greek classics or pre-Minoan culture? So these are Neolithic times. You have? Yeah, Neolithic times, so this is about 6,000 years ago. This is prehistoric, but the archaeological record shows us some really interesting things. It shows us a flourishing society that had enough excess to create beautiful buildings, to build aqueducts, to have very active things of agriculture, farming, and so forth. And that archaeological record also shows us that, or makes a, we can't say shows us, makes an extremely powerful case that this was a woman-led society. And that it was not woman-led in a dominator way where women made men subordinate. It was in a partnership way where men and women were equals. Lest you think this was an outlier, small case, it wasn't. This was the most flourishing center of the world right here in the Mediterranean basin, covering a very large range in the Mediterranean area. And then also, possibly, we don't know fully from the archaeological record, but the information is rising, also in parts of Northern Africa that were involved in trade and exchange, these areas with each other. So these areas were sharing information, they were sharing culture, and one of the things we know from the record from this time is this was a peaceful place. It was a peaceful place. We don't have weapons, like of spears for close-range combat. We don't have shields, but we have amazing technologies of agriculture, food preparation, and food storage that show that people were flourishing. We also have a lot of art. And much of the art shows this reverence of women. You know, the way that it's often talked about is a reverence and a priority for life-giving power rather than life-taking power, which is the command and control that came only about 1,000 years after the fall of Minoan Crete. One of the things that also gives us information on equality is there, you know, even fun activities like this sports. There's this thing called bull jumping. And I don't care, even for equality, I wouldn't jump over a bull, let me tell you. But women and men participated in this sport equally and as partners through the artistic record. Then this happened, a volcano came. And for quite a number of hundreds of years, volcanoes and then resulting tsunamis and tidal waves came and really made this population vulnerable in ways it hadn't been vulnerable before. And at that point, you know, invading, opportunistic people came in. Crete had bronze, and bronze was used for agriculture and other sorts of things, but bronze was also really good for weapons. So people who came in and wanted weapons came in and appropriated the use of bronze to create destruction and protection in a different sort of power dynamic. And within 1,000 years, we see a very different change. We see things moving from the more organic sort of form I showed you later, but to a much more rational and scientific form that shows much more emphasis on the male form than on the female form, and much more emphasis on the taking of life than on the giving of life. And at this point, according to some scientists who write about it, they say there was a change that happened. And women became units of production or reproduction for men. And the stories that evolved at that time had to put women in that place where they were subordinate and subservient in order for the dominant power structure, which was more of the command and control, to hold on its power. We moved from the partnership model to something that's called androgenic, which is more of a father and husband or father and male form of social structure. And I think that we can say that that story, we can see how that extrapolates as it goes forth today. I want to call myself out here and ask you to doubt something, because I know that going through some of your minds is going, yeah, but we needed to do that to get to where we are today. Or, yeah, but we needed to do that because men are stronger and they needed to protect women. The need for men to protect women is very important. Larger people to protect smaller people. Stronger people to protect more physically vulnerable people, especially if those physically vulnerable people are responsible for bringing the next generation into the world. That doesn't have to be true. That's a mental construct in human society. We don't have to live that way. And that is only one of the stories, one of the alternate scenarios for what has brought us to this place. And if we look at intact hunter-gatherer societies, societies that have lived for tens of thousands of years, sometimes more than hundreds of thousands of years, in places like the Amazonian rainforest in Brazil, in Amazonian rainforest in Africa and a number of other places, there is a very different power dynamic between men and women. And it often is separate, not separate, different but equal, each playing a different role. And feminine values, as well as masculine values, are valued equally in these societies. I did a search that I always find very interesting. I go to my favorite stock photo site, and I searched for men. And I get pictures of guys doing active, cool things in the world. They are agents of their own life. They're acting on what they want to do. The same search for women shows women. This is how deep the bias is. Being really objects of desire or objects of beauty for someone else. And in my work with women, I work as a leadership coach, I find that there are 4 dysfunctional behaviors that women often get pushed into, and they don't even know they're in them. We don't even know they're in them. But they have, by a lifelong conditioning of a mental construct, that they are lesser than, that they are not equals. And that's proving, pleasing, pretending, and protecting. It's playing a role to fill what we think is what we're supposed to be for society. I hope it's okay if I say bullshit. Can I say it? I know I'm being recorded. I call such bullshit. And when I started reading this book by Riane Eisler that's called The Chalice and the Blade, and it's the second book that sort of explored this theory. One has explored it more from a historical record, and this more from an anthropological record. I started feeling something awakening in me, and it was a truth I felt I'd carried all along. And that's like, I'm an equal, right? I'm not subordinate to anybody. And neither are you.
Exactly.
And neither are you. Neither are you. You're an equal. What would be possible if that were available to everyone? This is why we're in this room. I found something almost reassuring because I felt like, my God, maybe I wasn't crazy. There has been something weird going on all along. Right? So anything else we've heard, it's a story. It's a mental construct. And maybe mine is a story and a mental construct too. But I like it a lot better than the one I had before. It makes me respect, it gives me hope, and it helps me believe that something is better than what we have co-created here. And it's all relative, right? This is where we are now. We can do better, and I have hope in this room today that we will. But we forget that everything is relative. So I invite you to go back to where we began today, and that's doubt everything. Be your own judge. And when you feel judgment coming on, judgment of another, judgment of a scenario, go back in and think to yourself, what might I not yet understand? We see things that we've been conditioned to think in the past as real. Rainbow. It doesn't have to be this way. We can change. We can have a place where everyone can sit at the table, bringing their full selves with equality to the room. More than diversity. We have diversity in this room. Look at the representation here. We even have age diversity, look at me. We have inclusion. We're all looking at each other with respect and including and believing that these voices all matter. But with equality, which means getting out of our comfort zone and saying, hi, you're my equal. I'm David. Nice to meet an equal. What is possible? It's not always comfortable. For men, this means challenging some of the assumptions that have kept you safe with who you are all along. It's hard to give up power. I know, as a white woman, I've had to ask myself some tough questions. Would I have ever gotten that job at Apple in 1981 if I'd walked through that door as a person of color? I patted myself on the back so many times going, look at you. You made that happen. They rejected you the first time you sent your resume, but you stood up and told them they'd made a mistake. I could have never done that if I'd been a brown or a black woman, or if I'd had a physical disability. Never would have And for women, we can't do this on the dominator model that's gotten us to this bad place. We can only do it as equals and by seeing men as our partners in building something better. So it's not about what makes a great team. I'm bringing it back to the work, making it practical now. What makes a great team? It's not about that, right? That's what everyone asks. It's what makes a team great. And that's equality. True, giving people control of their own destiny, not asking them to prove, please, protect, and pretend in order to fit into someone else's model. And openness, the ability to say, I'm not feeling comfortable here. Can we talk about that as equals so we can come up with a better solution? Simply interacting with individuals who are different requires group members to prepare better, to anticipate challenges or alternate viewpoints, and to expect that reaching consensus is going to take effort. That can be uncomfortable. But with equality, it's safe. It's like exercise. You have to push yourself to grow new muscles. Pain, as the old saw goes, creates gain. In the same way, we need equality more than diversity if teams are going to change, grow, and innovate. We need to face each other in a new way, knowing we can build something better. That is your brain on equality. It's an all-access pass to so much more of the potential that we have as humans. And with that, thank you.
Any questions? I'll pass the mic around.
Oh,
Thank you.
I love questions.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank
so much.
you so
Another
much.
round of applause.
No. Any questions? Anything you want to know more about?
Lakshmi, yeah.
Lakshmi, thank you.
Thank you, Risha, for inviting me, and it's always a pleasure to see you speak.
Thank you.
So I have a comment, and it's also a bit of a question. So my background is that several years ago, I worked on the trading floor at one of the top investment banks, and then I took a break to follow my husband to India, and I quit. Mm-hmm. And it struck me that one day when I was on the trading floor and I was an employee of this big firm and earning X dollars, I was contributing directly to GDP.
Directly to June.
GDP, right? The next day, let's just say that I'm not employed anymore and I'm doing the good work of raising my kids. Mm-hmm. Someone else has taken my place. Mm-hmm. And I'm not contributing directly to GDP. Mm-hmm. I'm probably contributing only by the diapers I buy or the...
Being a consumer.
Being a consumer, exactly. Mm-hmm. So, it's been a number of years since I worked in that setting, and it's been a process of a journey for me to figure out what really is important and why is our society not able to measure these intangibles. And my question to you is, I think it was really interesting that you brought up the pre-Minoan civilization where women were partners with men. Mm-hmm. And my question is, if we had not shifted to the more male-dominant society, would we have GDP defined the way it is today, which is a very transactional, consumerist point, or would we possibly have something else?
I love your question so much. Is my mic still on? Yeah. Great. Thank you for asking that. So one of the things that we look is in the 1,000 years after the Minoan culture fell, there was a lot of wealth and technology that was transmuted from sort of practical, it was the ultimate sharing economy. But then those technologies became appropriated for use with more command and control hierarchies. Moving from the sharing economy, we move from the ambiguous. In a sharing setting, in a communal sort of setting, we don't know really, there aren't easy answers to who has more power, who has more this, and in fact the society pushes that down. There's a beautiful culture in Southern Africa called the San culture that actually has an incredible tool for keeping any sort of power dynamic down. It's so amazing. When men hunt, and they go out and they hunt, antelope is a very prized thing for them to hunt. And if a man or a hunter, and sometimes women hunt too, but primarily man, as someone comes back to the village where these people have held an intact society for, brace yourselves people, 150,000 years. It has worked. Something's worked. The men come back and they apologize. I'm sorry. I'm coming back unworthy. And everyone goes, why? What happened? And they go, the antelope. It's so small. It was weak. It couldn't run very fast. It's a ritual. And they're coming back and they're saying, this thing that I have no egoic attachment to. But at the time where we disambiguated the ambiguous, and the time is, if we really look, it's in that 1,000-year before the Common Era, with a real emphasis on what happened when written language came up around 700 years BCE at that time. We moved from the life of the ambiguous and the life of the myth into the life of reason and rationale. And we see this so much in the art, not only in the writing, where we were saying that answers, that human beings are rational creatures that create answers, and that the answers are going to prove what is right. You can see how a thought structure like that makes it very easy to say 2 pounds weighs more than 3 pounds. And the human brain, on an evolutionary level, loves more, more, more. So 3 pounds is better than 2 pounds. And you can look at that as a framework for seeing everything, in my opinion, doubt everything. Don't judge me, but doubt me. Right? In my opinion, I see this as a framework for explaining how we've gotten to this point where we are trusting our data more than we're trusting ourselves, where the person, where might leads to right, the person with the most money is the success. I have a question for you. Do any of you in this room know someone who has much, much more money than you have, than I have, than most other people have, but who you wouldn't call a success? I rest my case, but the money makes them a success, and they have the Lambo to prove it. Right? This is how we prove our success, is by disambiguating what wins. And that is the product of a thought structure that I think comes from post-Minoan Greece, and probably from some other places too, it's probably earlier than that, that says there is a way to win and power is going to get me there. So doubt it, but hold it. Question it. What does the question offer to you? Any other questions? Okay, thank you. You're wonderful.
Thank you
one
so
thing,
much,
I
Ellen.
didn't plug my book. Book plug, my book. I wrote a book. It's very different than this talk. It's a happy book. And since next Tuesday is, per the UN, International Day of Happiness, and I will be on the Today Show with Megyn Kelly that day. It's very exciting. This is the Happiness Hack, and this is a brain-aware guide to finding more focus, purpose, and satisfaction in your life. And if you know anyone who's looking for a little more happiness, or anyone who, and aren't we all, or anyone who is needs a little boost on International Day of Happiness, here's your book. Great. Thank you so much.
Chocolate?
Yes, the chocolate does. Great. I thank you all so much.